Over these last days, there's been that statement made that our destination is not nirvana or enlightenment or God realization or cosmic consciousness. It's a state of absence of illusion. And you could say that we've been delving into the inquiry as to what is the nature of illusion. But before continuing to delve in that way, there's an existential question to be posed to us to get those juices of awareness working. Because we can make a statement that was made by Divine Mother many times, as an absolute. Anything that changes is not real. But to arrive at that awareness, there's a great deal that lies in between. And so this existential question that's posed to us is, when we close our eyes, we're still seeing. Seeing is still present. When we block our ears, hearing is still present. When there are no emotions rising, feeling is still there. It's like has been proven, those people who appear to be unconscious or in a coma are still sensing, still feeling, seeing and hearing. Does this connote that these that we call our senses are permanent and unchanging? And if so, what does that mean in relationship to the recognition, at least in our mind, that anything that changes is not real, and seeking to find that which is unchanging and therefore real? There's a story about a man called Olaf. He lived in a city called Chelm. And life was hard for Olaf. It was very tough making a living for his family. And he lived through those times where there was famine and tempest and so forth. That changing world that was always so challenging. But Olaf had heard that in Warsaw there were people who, although they were busy and worked hard, were content and happy with their lot. So Olaf had aspirations to go to Warsaw. This was a dream that he had, and that dream bedeviled him until the day came when he said to his wife, "I'm going to Warsaw." And so he got together some bread and cheese and a flagon of water, and leaving his family, he set out on the road to Warsaw. But of course the journey was long and the days were hot, and there came a moment when Olaf had to rest. So he sat under a tree and got out his bread and his cheese and his flagon of water. And then he had a terrible thought. He thought, well, if I go to sleep, I'm at a crossroads here. When I wake up, I won't know which way is Warsaw and from where I came. Then he had a brilliant thought. So he took off his shoes and he placed them on the road in the direction of Warsaw, that when he woke up, he would know which way to go. And then, after eating his bread and cheese, he went off into a deep sleep. But it so happened that along the road came a farmer in his wagon, and seeing a pair of shoes in the middle of the road, he thought to himself, yes, I need a new pair of shoes. So he got down from his wagon, but when he picked up the shoes, he found that they were very careworn and had holes, and so they were no better than the ones he was wearing, so he dropped them down on the road again without heeding that he'd actually turned them round in different direction to which they'd been facing. But when Olaf woke up, he was delighted. He put on his shoes and set out on the road again, believing that he was heading in the direction of Warsaw. But as he went along, he started to see things that were thinking to himself, this is very familiar territory here, and as he got closer to what he could see was the town, he even bumped into someone who greeted him, "Hi, Olaf, how you going?" And he thought, you know what, this is just the tradesperson from in town. I wonder what he's doing here. So he got closer to town and was more and more familiar settings. The houses were the same as where he'd come from, and the shops were all the same, and even the people and the way they dressed. And then all of a sudden he heard a voice calling, "Olaf, Olaf, come on, when are you coming back in for dinner?" The dinner's on the table. You know, the leek and potato soup that was his daily fare. So he went in, he was quite amazed about this, that Warsaw was just like home. But you know, from that time on, dear Olaf, never again did he feel discontented with his lot or bemoaned his fate, because nothing could take away from him the belief that indeed he'd arrived in Warsaw. And then there's that story about the king. He was very proud and very arrogant, and like other stories of other kings, he too would venture out into the city in disguise, but not to see how the people were faring and inquire after their welfare. He was afraid. He was out checking whether there were any plots of sedition against him. This was his purpose of going abroad. But then one day when he was out with his vizier, he came to a little wooded area where there, in that place, there was an old man with a long white beard and long hair, tossing pieces of paper in the air. And the king couldn't resist asking him, what are you doing? And the old man said, well, I'm asking questions and getting answers. Oh, said the king, what are these papers telling you? And the old man said, well, this first piece of paper told me that you are the king in disguise and that you've got your grand vizier with you. And this second piece of paper says that your wife, the queen, has just given birth to a daughter. And the king asked, well, what is this third piece of paper? And the old hermit said, and this says that in a place nearby, a woman has given birth to a boy who will be your daughter's husband. Well, the king was intrigued. Please tell me where this place is immediately. So the hermit gave directions to where this boy was born. But when the king arrived there, he found it was a hovel. And when he went inside, the women had indeed just given birth to a son in this bare and denuded house, with not a crumb of food to be seen. So the king was totally affronted. My daughter will never be allowed to marry someone of this low station, a peasant, the son of a peasant. So he offered a great sum of money to the woman to relinquish her child. At first the woman said, "How can I give you my child?" But the king said, "If you are left, both you and the child will starve. I can offer the child a good life." And so she was convinced to relinquish her child and take the money. So the king with his vizier carried the child, but to the very next farm that they came to, which happened to be a wheat farm, the king handed the infant to his grand vizier and said, "Throw the child into the mill wheel." And so this is what the grand vizier did. And off they went on their way. But as it happened, the child's garment caught on the side of the mill wheel, and when the farmer came out, he heard the cries of the infant and was able to retrieve the child from the place in which it was hanging, and with great delight took it to his wife, who said, "We have the son that we've been so longing for to take care of us in our old age." So the child grew and became a helper to the farmer. But in the meanwhile there came a time when the king gloatingly said to his grand vizier, "You remember that time when we threw the child on the mill wheel? For such is the predictions of an old man." And his grand vizier very wisely said, "In the ways of God, anything is possible. One cannot go against fate." "Well, let's go and see," said the king. And they went back to the farm. And there was the farmer with the small boy. And the king asked, "Who is this?" He said, "He's my son." But then he told the story of how he was retrieved from the mill wheel. So the king, not to be foiled, again offered the farmer a great deal of money, saying that he would take the boy into his service. And so reluctantly the farmer again conceded and gave his adopted son over to the king. So this time the king said, "I will take care of this myself." And so as soon as they were on the road, the king took out his sword and beat the boy to a pulp, leaving his broken body in the middle of the road. The grand vizier said, leave him, he is all but dead." And they went on their way. But as it happened, there was a physician who was on his way, riding his horse to take care of a woman in childbirth. But when he came to the road that led to this place, his horse would not go. Even though the physician beat it, it refused to take that road. So the physician allowed the horse to have its head, and it took the roundabout route that took them on the road on which the young broken body of the boy lay. The physician descended from his horse and found that there was still life in the broken body. So he took it to himself and took care of the boy, bringing him back to health and full-bodiedness, taking him on as his apprentice and his son. But again there came a time when the king had the thought, again gloatingly, what about that time when I beat the boy to death? So much for the prediction of the old man. And again wisely the Grand Vizier said, the ways of God are infinite. One cannot go against fate. Let's go and prove it then. So they went out abroad to seek this boy, now almost grown to manhood. While they were about in the town, it so happened that the physician had come into town, being a man of great humility and kindness. He was caring for all those who came, and there was a young man taking the names, making the list on his behalf of who was going to be cared for. And when the king asked, who was this? The story was told of this kind-hearted physician, and willingly told of how he had taken upon himself a broken body, brought it to health, who was now his son and helper. The king was incensed, and again went to the doctor, the physician, offering him a great deal of money to be given the young man in service to him. And again the physician was brought and accepted the great sum. So now the king took a piece of paper and wrote on it a message, which was given to the boy with the request that he take it to the chief of the guards at his palace. Now in that letter was the instruction, whoever brings this letter to you, kill him immediately. So the young man dutifully took the letter to be presented to the king, the chief of the guards. But it had been a long day. He was tired, hungry and thirsty, and when he came to the gates of the palace, the fatigue and hunger was too much for him at the end of the day. So he lay down, carefully placing the letter under his head. But it so happened that the princess of the realm, unable to sleep, came out on her balcony and in the moonlight saw the figure of the young man lying at the palace gates. Her heart fluttered. This was a handsome young man. She was intrigued, so she sent a faithful servant down, and the letter was found. When it was brought back to her and she read it, in her heart she said, how can my father want to kill this handsome youth? So she rewrote the letter, placing on it the royal seal, and sent it back down to be placed under the head of the young man. So when he awoke in the morning and presented the letter to the chief of the guards, and it was handed to the Grand Vizier, because at that time and on that very day the king had been called away to war. He was gone for 3 years, but the Grand Vizier, fulfilling the contents of the letter, prepared a wedding between the princess and the young man. And in 3 years they happily had 3 children. When the king returned from war, there on the steps of his palace were 3 children. "Whose children are these?" said the king. "Why, they are yours," said the Grand Vizier, "your grandchildren, fulfilling what you stated in your letter. The wedding was arranged with your daughter, and these are their offspring." The king, of course, remembering the words of his Grand Vizier, all things are possible in the ways of God. One cannot go against fate, rang in his ears and his sensibilities. The nature of illusion, and the question that's been posed to us, tantamount to asking, what is it that is unchanging? Taking us to perhaps a fulfillment of that prayer, lead us from the unreal to the real. What does this pose, this question bring for us? Knowing that it is an existential question, and from our own experience alone can it be answered. What is unchanging? And therefore leading us to the recognition of what is real and what is unreal. What is always with us and does not change.